Welcome to this meeting of Carpinteria Birdwatchers for Thursday, May 18th. This meeting is going to be special and different. We've been doing these meetings for 4 years, almost 5 years, some fraction of 4 and some odd number of years. And we have never before tried to do both an online and an in-person meeting at the same time. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about birds of New Zealand, and we have 2 presenters. We have Steve Colwell, who recently made his first birding trip to New Zealand. Hello, Steve. Steve is remote, so he will be holding down the fort on the Zoom side. And then we also have Glenn Kincaid. Glenn is going to be in the room. In fact, he is in the room, but he has positioned himself just out of the field of view of the computer that's showing the room. That's Glenn's hand there. So, but both presenters will be talking about birds of New Zealand. As I say, Steve recently made his first birding trip there and did a cruise. And so we have some slides from Steve about his cruise and the interesting birds that he saw. And then Glenn will talk. Glenn has been, well, we'll introduce Glenn later, but Glenn spent a lot of time birding in New Zealand and is a well-known member of the Santa Barbara birding community, as is Steve. So there is sort of a tenuous Santa Barbara connection since we are Santa Barbara birdwatchers. Both of the birdwatchers presenting tonight are Santa Barbara birdwatchers, but we're going to talk about New Zealand birds. So before we get started, quick announcement. This Saturday, in 2 days' time, we will have an outing. We will be going back to the Carpinteria Bluffs, not the version where we go down to the Seal Hall out, but the version where we go east. So we meet at the Viola Fields parking lot, and then we walk east from there. Yeah.
Make sure, I think that's me. You make sure all Linda cannot hear you.
Huh. As my some of you remote folks, can you hear me okay?
I do.
Okay, so I'm guessing that Paul's issue is at his end. Maybe check the audio settings. Zoom is kind of a dark art. Okay, so this Saturday, 8 o'clock, we'll meet at the Viola Fields parking and visit the Carpinteria Bluffs to the east of that location. Should be a lot of fun. We've been there before, but it seemed like there were cool birds there. So we're going to go back and pester them again. It should be great fun. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start the meeting proper. And we'll begin with Steve Colwell. Steve, as I mentioned, is a Santa Barbara birder. He is famously, in my house at least, the birder who won the county big year competition last year. I was chasing him all year, or most of the year, and he ended up on top, which was really awesome. He was very impressive with the birds he was able to see. But this time we're going to talk about birds outside the county. As I said, birds in New Zealand. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can start. You know what? I'm not going to share my screen yet because that would be anticlimactic. I'm going to first go back up to the start of the presentation. There we go. And now I'm going to share my screen. This one. Okay. I believe that worked. So Steve, right. Give me a thumbs up if you're seeing your presentation.
Looks good. Yeah.
So take it away, Steve.
All right. Thank you, John. So I just went to New Zealand for a vacation. My wife and I went on a cruise. And so, of course, I had to take my camera and look at the birds. So this is my first time as a birder going to another country and checking it out. So the presentation here is just what a vacationer sees of New Zealand birds. So next slide, please. The cruise started in Queenstown, down south on the South Island of New Zealand. And then we arrived at Queenstown, then we drove quite a ways to get to Milford Sound and get on our cruise ship. So we'll take it in order and we'll do pictures from Queenstown and move our way around all the islands. Next slide. So in Queenstown, you're greeted by, most appropriately, the welcome swallow. So this swallow brings up one of the first interesting things. I have a bunch of questions still about New Zealand, and I'm eager to hear from Glenn because he knows all about New Zealand birds. what is going on that there's only one swallow. Every time you see a swallow, it's a welcome swallow, which is great for identifying them. You know how here you see a swallow in the sky and you have to work pretty hard to figure out which one it is. So very welcoming of it. Next slide. And there at Queenstown, we saw this gull, the black-billed gull. It was the most common gull there, I think. And I thought, oh, okay, that's the gull in this area, although we never saw these gulls in any other location. So I was wrong about that. So there's something about them being there, I guess. So maybe we'll hear from Glenn about that. But it did bring up something I started noticing, which is that just like with the swallow, there's only a few different gulls there. So, and they name them these very simple things, like this is the black-billed gull, and the natives call this other one, you know, a black-backed gull. We call it a kelp gull. But there's few enough gulls that they can just use a nice simple name with the colors and it works for them. Next slide. This is the ship. So we drove over to Milford Sound and got on this ship. So these ships are interesting because it's sort of an expedition ship and they have these Zodiacs, little transportable boats that take maybe 8 passengers at a time. And most of the excursions are with this ship just going somewhere, and then you all pile off into Zodiacs and zoom off in all directions and look at things. So you'll see that. Next slide. And as soon as we get out to sea on the cruise ship, the first thing I see is a sooty shearwater. And that's amazing. I mean, we see them occasionally anyway, but the interesting thing to me is that, yes, it's really true. These sooty shearwaters go over the entire world. Probably this sooty shearwater was here at some point, because I know sooties cruise all through the Pacific, and there it was. So it showed that to these birds, the world is such a small place. Next slide. And then right after that, my first albatross. I was really hoping to see some albatrosses down there. It turns out, and I don't know why it is, there's so many seabirds in New Zealand. You just see them all over the place. As we're cruising around in the cruise ship, it turned out, I mean, there were just dozens of them going by all the time. And you could hardly miss them. So it was great because I really like them. They're a pretty bird. Next slide. So this, don't start yet, John. This is a one of the Zodiacs, and this is my cruise Zodiac. My wife's there in the purple with me, and this guy driving it, one of the guides, he is an adventure nut. So he wanted to drive right into this waterfall. So this video gave you a little example of what New Zealand looks like there. This is in one of the sounds near Milford Sound. Go ahead. So he just roars right in there. In fact, he took us in twice because he loves it so much, getting us all wet. But it's beautiful country. And now we're coming out excited. Yes, there we are. And we were really excited. Next
I'm
slide.
sorry, I tried to stop it at the right moment and I couldn't do it. My controls were getting in the way.
Go for the next slide. That's fine.
Oops. All right. The going in and out of video is tricky. Here, I'm going to have one more try at catching it. All right, so I sort of caught you there.
Yeah, so that's me on the right-hand side, second from the right. And I was pretty excited, and notice me covering my camera there. That's an okay, on to the next.
All right, I think I'm going to have to pop out of this for a second. Let's see if I can do this right.
I think last time you continued the video and it just went on.
Yeah, that's true. It just, if we let it end, then I can go on to the next thing with just advancing the slide, I think. No, it doesn't want to do that.
Yeah, the videos are tricky, switching in and out.
All right, I'm going to do it this way. Okay. No, I don't want to do this again.
Well, while he's showing us this, I'll tell you another thing, which is that so there's several classes of birds that I find really puzzling about New Zealand. One is the seabirds, you know, that we see these deep ocean birds so close up. And then you'll see more about the other classes in a moment. This is a fur seal. So I'm on this cruise ship and I'm pretty much the only birder. And all the other people really want to see the cute seals all the time. So we'd go out in the Zodiac and there'd be a little contest to try to see, are we going to see seals today or are we going to see birds? So this day we saw seals. They are really cute, this little baby. Next slide. And we're still in the sounds around the west side of the South Island for these shots. So in one of them, we discovered a Fiordland penguin. And the cool thing is you're just cruising along in your Zodiac, you know, you see a gull off in the distance, and then there's penguins swimming next to you. I'm not used to that. I've seen pictures of penguins standing in the Antarctic, but never swimming there. And they're very cute, but very hard to get a picture of. Next slide. So now we made it around the Sound and we went to this southern island, Stewart Island. And these islands are really interesting because you've got the South Island of New Zealand, then you've got this little sub-island, Stewart Island. And then the cool thing is when you go into the bay there to go to the city and the town in Stewart Island, then there's another little island in the bay called Ulva. And so we went to Ulva first and then to Stewart Island. Next slide. And it's interesting because they try hard to keep everything protected on these islands. You know, you see rat boxes everywhere because they're trying to keep all the mammals off because a lot of the native birds can't handle the threat of mammals. This is a saddleback. So they're on Ulva. This is the best picture I got because they're a little skulky, but we could hear it rustling around and singing, and finally got a picture of it. Next slide. This is a Stewart Island robin, I think is the name of it. So they've got certain birds that are specific to certain islands. Like there's several other robins, I think, at least one other in New Zealand. So this one's just down there in Stewart Island. Next slide. Very cute, by the way. He wouldn't stop bugging us when he saw us on the trail. Now these guys, this is the other class of bird that's interesting there is flightless birds, besides penguins that are flightless. So flightless land birds, like this is a weka. And, you know, very often one of the tourists would see it and go, kiwi, because it looks kind of like a kiwi. But unfortunately not a kiwi. Kiwis are quite hard to see. They're nocturnal. I never saw one. I didn't feel like stumbling around in the dark. But these guys, you can't get away from them. They're digging in your backpack, trying to get stuff if you leave it set down for a minute. And very curious characters. Next slide. So then when we're going back from Stewart Island, we see this guy swimming next to us, and I don't even know what it is. Later, I find out it's a little penguin. And so it's a penguin, even though it doesn't have that black and white thing like penguins do. In fact, the skin on its back looks kind of like fish scales, but you know, it's a penguin. And also the name is confusing because they call it, I think the tour guides there would say it's a little blue penguin, but the eBird list puts it as a little penguin. So it's a little puzzling. There's a lot going on with the naming. That's not even counting the Maori name, the native language name there in New Zealand. I'm sure they have another name for it. Next slide. This is a fantail. So this is a fairly common bird when you're walking in the woods. And these guys are also another very curious bird that won't leave alone. This one actually followed us down the trail and flutters about and fans its tail. Very nice to see. Pretty little guy. Next slide. This is a tui. So tui is the Maori name of this one. That's what everybody calls it down there. And the other name is the parson bird, I guess because of the little white tufts. And these guys have a nice melodic song. So when you're walking through the forest down there, you just hear these tones all over, very musical. And it's from bellbirds and these guys, tuis. Next slide. Okay, then we have a Buller's shearwater, a Buller's albatross, sorry. So this was again, just as where the whole cruise ship was pulling out from that location, we saw another kind of albatross. I'm used to the albatrosses, you know, you have to ride and be ill on the pelagic trip here for hours to get to where you could see an albatross. So it was amazing that we would just see them all the time. And this one has a very sassy yellow bill thing going on and a fierce look. Good looking guy. Next slide. Okay, then we got to the first real town. All the stuff before this had been little teeny towns. Then we got to Dunedin. So in Dunedin, they have quite a bit of stuff going on. So we went to more city type stuff. So in one of the gardens there was this guy, which is a European greenfinch. So I've never seen a greenfinch before, but I guess they, you know, there's no house finches, none of that. The only familiar bird I saw the whole time I was there, by the way, was a house sparrow. They have those. But all the other birds we have here, like house finches, you got guys like this replacing them. Next. Okay, so we left Dunedin, worked our way up to Kaikoura. And the thing about Kaikoura, one is there was a chance I was going to see Glenn there because he was living there at that time of the year. But it didn't work out because of my cruise ship's weirdness. So unfortunately, I had to go on my own to the albatross encounter that Glenn had put me on to. But I was looking forward to that because I didn't know at the time I set it up, I was going to see albatrosses off the ship all the time, but this promised to have them really close up. Next slide. And sure enough, this grizzled old guy drives our boat out on the albatross encounter, and this guy knows everything about these birds. So he sees them like a mile off, not using binoculars or anything, and says, oh no, that's the wrong kind. And he hits another way and he gets here. So this is, I'm not positive, but I think this is a wandering albatross. And that's the big white guy. And the two black big guys are northern giant petrels, a bird I'd never heard of before. They're kind of vulture-y looking in a way. We'll see them closer up in a sec. And the two in the back are Cape petrels. So petrels, I mean, my gosh, you never see petrels here. Certainly not just sitting in the water. So it is beyond chumming. The thing he's eating, they have this frozen bag of fish guts and the birds are just fighting over it. Next slide. As you can see a little closer, there's just the same birds. Next slide. Okay, here's a little video so you can see how they sound.
Because I muted YouTube. Okay, we're gonna have to try this again. Sorry.
Okay.
Because of the. All right, we're gonna do this one more time.
He seems happy enough with it.
When you I don't have it in this video, but when that big guy starts getting that fish bite,
And back to the same problem of not knowing how to get to the next slide.
oh yeah. Okay, on to the next.
Here we go. All right.
Okay, go ahead.
Found myself.
So this is a northern giant petrel. They think they're all tough, but they run pretty scared from that albatross. Okay, next slide. Then we saw other birds flying around us, you know, because they're attracted by the food action. So this is a Westland petrel, I think is the name of it. Let me just check so I'm not saying something wrong. Yeah, Westland petrel, and very pretty bird. And our guide said this is somewhat of a rare bird. I'll be interested to see what Glenn says about that. Next slide. Then on getting back to harbor at Kaikoura, there's this heron. This is the only heron I saw the whole trip, I guess. This is a Pacific reef heron. So like ours, but very nice gray color. Never having traveled to see birds before, maybe this is the usual way, but it's really cool to see just different birds filling the niches. And this being the only heron, you know, we don't have egrets and great blues like we do, just this one. If you see a heron, it's this. Next slide. Okay, we continued up and headed between the North and South Islands. And there we saw a bunch of gannets. We started seeing many more gannets, like a gannet colony we saw. So this is a gannet. Next slide. And these guys are great because when they dive, they just become this complete torpedo and shoot in the water and barely make a splash. So if you ever see it on the internet, it's astounding how they just fold everything up and become an arrow. Next slide. Okay, so we were at Abel Tasman, and then we are supposed to go next to Napier and Gisborne, but there had just been a cyclone there, which is their word for hurricane, and it had kind of messed up all the ports. So they were like, no, you can't go there. So our cruise ship was like, huh. So they just kind of dawdled along the coast for a while, and we skipped those and went up to the Great Barrier Island. Next slide. So up at Great Barrier Island, we saw this, which is their sole kingfisher in New Zealand, I believe. And this is called a sacred kingfisher. Ooh. Next slide. Okay, so we then went on to Auckland, which was the final stop of our trip. And that's a big city. That's the biggest city in the islands. And so we saw city birds, but even the city birds are cool when you go a place like that. This is a myna, so very interesting. Next slide. And this is theirs, every city's got to have in the park some black bird. And so their black bird seems to be this magpie. I forget the name. I think it's maybe Australasian magpie. Very cool name. Next slide. And then here, I was very excited to just see sitting in the wild one of these parroty things. I don't know if this is a parrot or a parakeet. It's called a Eastern Rosella. So that was our final bird for the trip, and it was very nice to see this colorful thing. It's quite shy, so you'd think you could see it in a second, but with all those colors, but you had to chase it down. It was tough. So that was the end of our trip. And it left me wondering what is going on with these crazy seabirds and the wingless birds, there's and how there's relatively few birds on the, in addition to being few species. The other interesting thing was that there were kind of few individual birds. It was relatively quiet in most of the walks you would do, not that much around, except for the tuis and bellbirds. So I'd be interested to hear from Glenn, what's up with New Zealand that makes it that way? On to the next.
Yeah, I think that's the last slide, right?
Right, we're done.
Okay, I will stop the share. If I can get my mouse cursor.
And that
back.
was my trip to New Zealand.
Well, thanks very much. That was really cool, Steve. So do we want to do a quick Q&A, questions for Steve before we take a break, and then we'll go on to Glenn? How do we feel about that? I see no objections. Any questions for Steve? Feedback?
Maybe at the end.
Okay, at the very end?
Yeah.
Okay, we can do that. Okay, Laurel suggests we'll have a wide-ranging Q&A at the end of the of the next presentation, which will be from Glenn. So I'm gonna say we're gonna be on break for about 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll start up again. We're gonna switch out our computers, and when next you see us, Glenn will be presenting his own perspective on New Zealand birds. So stay tuned for that.
Thank you, Steve. Whew. Now I want to go.
Yeah, it's a nice place. It makes it for easy birding.
Oh, yeah.
Because at the beginning of the trip, is it okay if I talk during the break?
I can hear you.
Okay. At the beginning of the trip, I had no plan to even try to learn the names of all the species.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, I'll just see a bird, I'll take a picture. And then, but it turned out to be easy because, as I say, there's only one swallow, 3 different gulls. So it was easy to learn. Like here, it's kind of grueling to learn the difference of some of these things. So so it made it very relaxing and vacation-y to go and go, oh, look, a tui.
So I'm interested in New Zealand's kind of an island, but actually it's quite large island. I mean, is that why you have quite a bunch of different species in that area of where you were?
It's about the size of California roughly.
Yeah,
And
okay.
so
That's not
it's
bad.
got, a couple of latitudes in it.
Mhm.
So you get quite a range, and being pretty far toward the South Pole, I guess that's why they get all those penguins. And there's something about the currents down there that bring all the albatrosses too. Like I've seen things, Glenn will probably talk about this, but as you go further south, the winds pick up and it's just covered with those petrels and albatross type birds. Yeah, it's a great vacation, and the people are very nice. There's a whole cultural thing going on there. They're really trying hard. Like, seems like everybody has to study Maori language in the schools. So, and like if you ever we flew on Air New Zealand, and everything's repeated in Maori, and they teach you words for stuff. They're proud of it.
How was the weather? How was the boat, being on the boat? Was it pretty calm, or because that could be kind of a gnarly area, to use the technical term?
Well, we got there immediately after the cyclone. In fact, it seemed like we were going to not make it and some people didn't make it because the cyclone blew out their air travel. So, but it just died down. We just got in. So there was that. And then and there was some wind left. And the boat was, even though it was a cruise ship, it was moving. Personally, I think the stabilizers on this cruise ship were not as good as some others. I was a little ill.
Oh.
They're moving things around. See, now the next thing they should do for these joint in-person and Zoom sessions is they ought to have our mic and speaker work in here, because I see they're talking there. What are they talking about?
I don't think it's that interesting, but if you HTML cable, yeah.
Your daughter must be Julia. Hi, Julia.
Hey, Julie, you there? She's probably there. Maybe she's doing something with her toddler kid, but
I know you've been spending a lot of time in San Diego.
it's true. Every other week, pretty much. But it's worth it. Wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Linda. Julie and I are tag teaming, taking Rowan to bed, but we wanted to share the Zoom meeting.
That's Robert Thomas, my son-in-law, and Julia's husband, obviously. Hey, Rob. Been enjoying
Hey, Linda, how's it going?
Good. You've been watching all those great birds in New Zealand. Oh my gosh.
Absolutely. No, Julia said that I could basically tag in and spend some time on the bird meeting.
Okay. Well, there's the next part coming up. Oh, that's New Zealand. Okay.
Great.
Now, hopefully, Glenn will answer all our questions. He really knows the place, living there all the time.
Glenn, I'm sorry that I don't remember this, but I know your son went to Santa Barbara Middle School, right? Correct? No, he can't hear me. I think his son was with my daughter.
We can hear you. You just haven't been able to hear us.
Okay.
Can you hear us now?
Yep. I can.
Yes, my son did go to middle school. He was a year behind Will, I think, or two, maybe.
Okay. Okay. So he's so not Julia, but with William. Okay. Thank you.
Right. Yep.
Okay, well, should I do a quick introduction?
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to hear from Glenn, who, as you've just heard, had his kids went to the same middle school that our kids went to, which is cool. So the first that I heard about you, I think, was even before then, Glenn, because you did your green big year in Santa Barbara County, and
Right.
was that like mid 2010s, 2014, 2016? So Glenn did a county big year that was just human powered. So you were basically biking everywhere, right?
Yep.
And what do you remember what your species totals was?
285.
Very impressive, very impressive number. Okay, anyway, he's here to talk about New Zealand birds. Take it away, Glenn.
Okay, so for those who I haven't yet met, I'm Glenn Kincaid, and after living in Santa Barbara from 1985 to 2005, our family moved to New Zealand, where we lived for about 5 years before we came back to Santa Barbara. And during that time is when I really got interested in birds. So it's a fascinating place. And what I'm going to start with is a little story about how the birds in New Zealand got to be what they are. And so hopefully that will answer some of Steve's questions. And if not, then we'll take questions. Okay, so here's New Zealand, satellite view, and it's actually sitting on a little underwater continent. And it's about a 3-hour flight to Australia. And it's about what would you say, Steve, about a 12-hour flight to Auckland from Los Angeles. And if we superimpose New Zealand on North America in terms of size and latitude, that's kind of what it looks like. The very top of New Zealand is sort of on par with Los Angeles, and the very bottom down at Stewart Island puts you up near Seattle. And in terms of land area and population, it's about the size of Colorado, but it's long and skinny. And the climate is, of course, impacted by the fact that it's surrounded by the ocean, and down at the bottom, the ocean's pretty cold. So the weather tends to be not as nice as it is here. And in terms of the birds that we're going to talk about, the territory of New Zealand has the two main islands, the North and South Island, and also Stewart Island, the one that Steve talked about down south. That's kind of like the third island. And if you look at really old maps of New Zealand, the South Island is called the mainland. It's the middle island. But there's all of these remote islands that are included in the territory of New Zealand. And that's sort of the same thing as having the Channel Islands here, where there's a lot of things that you'll find on the Channel Islands that you don't really find in the rest of New Zealand. So if you were to talk just about the main part of New Zealand, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting. And you also might notice that some of the annotations on those islands are, pest-free and mice eradicated. And that's very important stuff that we'll get to. And as Steve mentioned, there's a lot of weird birds in New Zealand. There's flightless birds, the kiwi, of course, the kakapo, famous flightless parrot, and the weka that he showed is a rail, flightless rails. And there's even, in some of the remote islands, flightless ducks, which seems kind of weird, and more than usual nocturnal birds, the kiwi, of course, and the parrot, the kakapo. And they also have the world's only alpine parrot, the kia, which lives way up on the high parts of the South Island. And the only that I know of alpine nesting seabird, the Hutton's shearwater, which nests way up in the mountains. And when they arrive, they often have to dig snow out of their burrows to get into them. So there's a lot of interesting birds in New Zealand. And a main reason why they're so strange is the geologic history of New Zealand. So here we have the kiwi, which is of course flightless, and it doesn't even have any wings at all. And it's typically nocturnal. I have seen a couple in the day, but it's pretty unusual. And then that real cool looking parrot there is the kakapo, and it's a flightless nocturnal parrot. And it's a totally cool bird and one of the most endangered as well. So if we go way, way back in time, New Zealand was part of, the big global continent there. And at the time that it broke away to become its own land mass, birds were around because, of course, birds are just dinosaurs with feathers, but mammals didn't yet exist. And New Zealand drifted away from the rest of the continents and didn't have any land mammals until man arrived and brought them. And so this meant that these birds evolved in an environment where their only predators were raptors. And so here we see moa, which are extinct flightless birds. I think there were 9 species of moa, anywhere from 3 to 9 feet tall. And that eagle is a Haast eagle, and it's the largest eagle ever recorded on Earth. And so the birds had no need to fly away from predators, and their main bird predator was out during the day, so they became nocturnal. And then things changed. Man arrived. The Polynesians, which are now the Maori, arrived maybe 1,000 to 1,200 years ago. And then the Europeans showed up quite a bit later. The first European to see and document New Zealand was Abel Tasman, a Dutchman. He didn't set foot on it. And the first person from Europe to set foot was Captain James Cook. And that's when the environment really started to change in New Zealand. The sort of the upper left map shows what is believed to be the forest, the native forest cover when the Maori arrived 1,000 years ago. And then the one to the right of that is the state of affairs when the Europeans arrived. And you'll notice, especially on the South Island, a lot of the forest has been removed for agriculture. And then the big map is the state of affairs today, where proportionally there's very little native bush left in the country. And people also brought all kinds of animals, intentionally and unintentionally. This picture is a scrolling screen in the National Museum in Wellington that just has hundreds and hundreds of species of animals that were brought, and all kinds of weird things, zebras and kangaroos and lots of European birds and just a multitude of things, many of which did not have a good impact on the local native bird population. And the most devastating ones are these 3: rats, stoats, and the Australian possum. And they are so devastating because these birds evolved in an environment where they didn't have predators. So they have no defenses. Many birds that in New Zealand that can fly still nest on the ground. And in areas where birds evolve with predators, they get defenses, like they don't have a smell, so the predators can't smell them. Well, none of the birds in New Zealand have that. So when these predators started arriving, the birds started disappearing. And here's a take on the list of birds that have become extinct in New Zealand since the arrival of humans. And it's a big list, especially when we see there's not all that many species. As Steve pointed out, there's not a lot of species there. So huge, huge amount of biodiversity has already been lost. And so where are we at today? Well, I didn't update this because I'm kind of lazy, but as of a few years ago, I don't think these numbers are far off. So there's basically 170 species of native birds in New Zealand. And of those, 91 are not found anywhere else on Earth. So that's pretty amazing. And the kiwi is a whole order unto itself. There's 5 species of kiwi. And you'll see on the graphs below, the condition of the species is pretty grim. You know, there's only 20% or less of the species are not threatened. And primarily due to habitat loss and mostly the predators. Predators are a huge problem. And so some of the numbers that we're talking here, these are also about 4 years old, but so the tycho, which is a petrel, which was the first one was harvested in 1865, and the next one was found in 1978. And because one guy thought they got to be out there somewhere, and so he found them, and so they've actually had a very good breeding year this year. So they're probably up to 100 pairs. So that's the whole population. And the black stilt, which I've seen described as the rarest wader in the world, they're probably up to about 200, counted 200. The kakapo, like we were talking about, I think they're up over 250. The black robin is like a fascinating story. They got down to 5, population 5 with 1 female. And just the story of how they rescued that species alone is like a whole talk. It's fascinating. And the takahe, which is the world's largest rail, which is also flightless, had only been sighted, I think, 4 times in the late 1800s before it was rediscovered in like 1947. And they managed to save it. And then there's the king shag, which is an interesting one. It has a very super limited range, but the population seems to be stable. It's really lives in like 100-mile radius area, but it seems to be steady. And the penguin, yellow-eyed penguin, is I think the rarest one, and they've been having trouble with disease. And the black-billed gull, which Steve mentioned, in New Zealand, they've described that as the world's most endangered gull, even though it seems to have a very large population. The population trend is straight down, and it's really declining very rapidly. And there are certain areas where you can see them, like Steve did in Queenstown, but over most of the country, you don't see the black-billed gull. So it's really cool to go out and see a bird where, you know there's only a few hundred of them out there, and you get to see one. So it's pretty cool. So New Zealand has been very proactive and innovative to try and save their species. And first and foremost, they try and figure out how to control these pests, because if you don't do anything, like most of the native birds in New Zealand would just be extinct. And then they have, then they get really clever. Like they have these island sanctuaries, like Steve went to Ova Island. So it's easier once you get all the pests off an island to keep them off an island. Although Ova Island is very close to the mainland, and the rats can actually swim to it. So last year, it recently got, and like you said, there's traps all over the place, and they're monitoring everything, and they dogs and the whole deal, but it's still a struggle. And then they do species translocation. So they would take the entire population, they would try and capture the entire population of the species and move it to a safe place. And they've done that with a number of species, like the black robin and the saddleback and all that stuff. Very interesting. And then they've played with birds where they realized, okay, if bird lays a clutch of eggs, they can actually take those away and raise them elsewhere, and the bird will lay another clutch of eggs. And then they take the eggs that they've taken, they give to surrogate parents, which may not even be of the same species, and they get raised, and this is how they build up their populations. And of course, they need to worry about genetic diversity, especially with things like the black robin, where there was only one female. Maybe not so much you can do there, but like the kakapo, that parrot, there were two separate remnant populations, and so they actually try and manage the breeding a little bit to maximize their diversity. And they get communities involved in, as we will see. So here's some of the offshore island reserves, and way down at the bottom, off of Stewart Island is the one that Steve went to. And there's a lot of them. So it's a very, very popular thing. There's Ova Island, where I have actually seen kiwi. And then they create these sanctuaries on land where they've developed this pest-proof fence. And so they surround the area with this fence to keep the pests out, and then they trap them all out from inside or get rid of them. And then they maintain traps inside because, one comes in a vehicle or manages to get over the fence or whatever. And so this is sort of an up and coming thing where they actually have sort of like land islands where they can get the native species going. And the predators, it's always the predators. And they have this huge undertaking where as of 2016, they had a program where they said, okay, we are going to eradicate all predators in New Zealand by 2050, which is completely ridiculous, but they throw a lot of resources at it, and they've made a lot of progress, and there's a lot of areas where now native birds are coming back because they're getting rid of the pests. And a lot of that is community involvement. So they kind of broke this down into a couple phases where they're just trying to increase the amount of area where the native birds can live. And then realizing that you're never going to be able to trap everything out. So they're working on some sort of solution, like a genetic thing, or like a total game changer thing that would allow them to eliminate entire species of pests. But I don't know that any of that's actually really come to fruition yet. So if you go around to local birding spots, you'll see a lot of this. And these are traps, and they have whole lines of traps that local volunteers go out and check every week. And they've also developed new technology. This is a repeating self-resetting trap that they can put out in remote areas. And so they get some sort of long-lasting, like a pheromone or something that will attract the animals over a long time, so you don't have to keep replacing the bait. And then there's basically a pneumatic piston, and when the animal sticks its head up in the little thing, the piston whacks it in the head and then retracts back, and the animal dies, but the trap is still ready to go. It's not exactly clear what happens to the dead animal, but it seems to work. Yeah, no vultures. And one major part of the plan is poison, which they call 1080. And it's controversial, but it works great. And the reason it works great is it works on mammals. And there are no native mammals. And if you're not a mammal, the side effects are quite minimal. And so basically, without this poison, many more species of New Zealand birds would be gone. So they're working on a way to get past it, but at the moment, it's an essential part of the program. So that's kind of the story of why birds in New Zealand are the way they are. You know, it's a relatively small landmass. It's been isolated from other continents for a long time. And so in one way, the diversity of species is low. Like Steve said, there's one kind of swallow, there's 3 kinds of gulls, there's but a lot of the species that they have are only found in New Zealand, or they might breed in New Zealand and wander elsewhere, like albatrosses. But they do have a pretty unique set of native birds. And in addition, there's all kinds of introduced birds, mostly from Europe. So Steve said the only thing you recognized was a house sparrow. But if you're coming from Europe, you'll recognize a lot of the birds, a lot of the finches and the starlings, the sparrows. You know, the English people like to bring their birds with them. And one interesting thing is they brought redpolls. And to this day, nobody in New Zealand knows what type of redpolls they are. I'm a PhD student, could have a field day with this, but and so that kind of brings us to the state of affairs as they are. And so now we're just going to move on to some more general topics and see where it goes. So one thing they're doing in New Zealand at the moment, they're in year 4 of a 5-year project to basically try and count the population of the birds in New Zealand. And typically in the past, this would be done by, you know, a small army of biologists that would go out all over the country and try and take inventory of the birds. But they're trying something new, which is eBird, and they're getting us to do it. And it's really cool. They've broken the country into a grid of 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer sections. And so you go out and they say you're going atlasing. So you go out and you do your eBird list, but you make sure that it's all in one section so that they can break it down and analyze the data and extrapolate the data. And I'm really looking forward to how this comes out. It turns out that the people running it are in the town I live in. So I get the scuttlebutt, and these guys, they're working for the Atlas for 5 years. So all they do is they go out and generate eBird checklists all over the country. So it's pretty cool. Okay, so now we'll talk about some interesting species, and this particular one, bar-tailed godwit, and in the Maori, the native language, kuaka. And if you go to the departure area of the Auckland airport, they have statues of these like flying as you go up the stairs to your gate. They're like flying with you as they leave the country. And these are interesting because they undertake the longest migration of any bird on the planet. So they winter in New Zealand and Australia, and they breed in Siberia and Alaska, mostly Alaska. And so this is a plot of the quickest one that is known to have gone from Alaska to New Zealand, but that record was broken last year, where they tracked one that went from Alaska to Australia and nonstop in 11 days, over 8,000 miles. And how did they know this? So here's a bird that I saw there in 2021. And the first thing I noticed was that it was banded. And I always like to report my banded birds, but then I noticed it had an extra little tail, and that's the GPS tracker. And so that's how they know the migratory habits of these birds. And so I was able to get in touch with the fellow that runs this program, and he pointed me to the website. And so I was able to follow this bird as it flew up to Alaska. Unfortunately, it never returned, or the tracker fell off, or something, but while it lasted, it was very cool. So that's an interesting little project that they got going on there. And as Steve mentioned, he saw lots of albatrosses. And that's because New Zealand has more albatrosses than anywhere else in the world. Of more than half of the species of albatross in the world breed in New Zealand, which, but you wouldn't have guessed that. I didn't know that. But they are almost exclusively on those remote islands that we talked about. And it's a species that the conservation people in New Zealand like to keep track of, because if the albatrosses are doing good, lots of things are doing good. And if the albatrosses are not doing well, that means there's some serious problems. And unfortunately, most of the albatrosses are not doing that well. There's a definite lack of fish because the ocean is warming, and far too many of them get caught by fishing boats. Fishing boats lay out these lines that lay on the top of the ocean with bait on them, and albatrosses come down and they get caught and drown. So it's kind of a drag. So here are all the albatrosses in the world. Nice little cartoon thing. And the ones that I put red dots on are the ones that you would normally see in New Zealand waters that aren't vagrants. And this little group down in the middle that has the cool looking bills, they're sometimes called the small albatrosses, but in New Zealand, they have a very cool name. They're called mollymawks, which is a Scottish word. And it's really cool to say, Buller's mollymawk. They do have this kind of like this space look to them, this like really futuristic look. Very cool. And as Steve encountered on his albatross boat, there's the wandering albatross, and this photo is taken from that same boat. And here's a royal albatross, and these things have the largest wingspan of any bird in the world. And here's one that you only see out on the Chatham Islands, which is about 300 miles off of the South Island, the Chatham mollymawk, very cool looking bird. And it says that they're naturally uncommon, but the problem is that the entire world's population breeds on this one rock, pyramid, and it doesn't smell very good. But it's really cool to see. And there is one spot on the mainland part of New Zealand that albatrosses breed on, and that's in Dunedin city on the South Island that Steve visited, and it's called the Tairoa Head, and it's a big ridge right out by the ocean. And there's one flying over at the top. These are royal albatrosses, and they just make their nest in the grass there, and it's really cool. You can go visit there and climb way up to the top, and the wind is just howling unbelievably, and the birds are just sitting there like it's, you know, a day at the beach. And over the last couple of years, they started, you know how they have these nest cams and stuff. Well, they set one up there. They picked one of the nests that has a good view, and they put the camera out there, and then you can just check in on your albatross. And typically there's one parent sitting on the nest, and the other parent will go out to sea for, you know, 4 to 8 days. And then they come back and they trade places, and they have one chick And the staff goes out on a regular basis and weighs the chick. She's got the chick in the bag there. And she's weighing it. So it's very cool thing to see. And penguins. New Zealand also has more kinds of penguins than any other place in the world, which I wouldn't have guessed. 6 of the 18 species in the world breed in New Zealand. 3 are on the mainland and 3 are off the mainland. This picture here is an erect crested penguin that I went to see in January this year. And for the penguins that don't live on the mainland, this is typically how you see them. They come ashore to molt and they find a little spot and they just stand in there for like 2 weeks and then they leave. And so of your penguins, the ones with the red dots are the ones that are typically found in New Zealand. The top row there, the erect crested, that breeds on offshore island. The Fiordland penguin is the one that Steve saw. Those breed on the mainland. And the little blue or fairy penguin, again, the names, the birds tend to have all kinds of different names there. And just depends who you're talking to. And then on the bottom, the rockhopper and the snares penguins breed on offshore islands, and the yellow-eyed penguin also does breed on the mainland. So this picture is a snares crested penguin that I saw on Stewart Island when I was down there. And so the little penguin is the most common one, and that breeds all around both islands, and in fact likes to build their nests under people's houses. Which is great, except they make a lot of noise, and so it's rather disruptive. And the Fiordland and the yellow-eyed penguin breed really only in the south part of the South Island, and then the other species breed on the remote islands and occasionally show up on the main part when they're molting. So here's a little blue penguin out of the water, and they will actually come out of the water and walk quite a distance into the forest to their nesting spot. When they put nesting boxes out, they're often hundreds of yards from the ocean, so it can be very strange. You know, you think you're quite a ways away from the beach, and the penguin will be walking down the path. It's kind of bizarre. And then there's the yellow-eyed penguin, one of the rarer ones. This one was breeding in Dunedin, kind of the south part of the South Island. And so, you know, New Zealand has not a great diversity of birds. When people come visit New Zealand for a bird tour, typically it's a 3-week adventure, and they start at the top of the North Island and go to the bottom of the South Island, and you'll see maybe 125 species. And that's when you're being guided by people who know what they're looking for and know where the birds are. But you get some very high quality birds, so it's pretty cool. I don't know how we're doing for time, but
yeah, we could, wrap up soon if you're getting towards the end of your slides and have time.
I mean, if people have questions about particular things, we could talk about that. I mean, there's many great stories. I could just keep going, but
okay, are we sort of running off the end of your slides? Do you want to go back to just the Zoom meeting?
I have a lot more slides, but I mean, this is sort of where I figured,
Yeah, well, I think this would be a good place maybe to transition to Q&A.
Okay.
If you're up to that.
I guess first would be like, Steve, did we answer all your questions?
Well, you answered a lot of them. Yeah, let's hear what other people have to ask. Yeah, I'm satisfied.
Okay, well, Can we make sure that your camera is on so that we can see you, Glenn? I'm not sure you're coming in on the.
Ooh.
Or if we could just stop the screen share and then we could just see all the,
I could just scan up.
we could just transition back to this computer for the Q&A part.
Okay, I'll do that.
Okay. Why don't you hand me the, yeah, we'll reconnect to the big screen for the people in the room.
I guess a question I have is, are there a lot more fish down there? Is that why there's so many albatrosses?
There
You just got muted.
Try it.
Well, there must be a good number of fish to support that level of seabird life. However, in general, the seabirds there are suffering because the fish population is declining, and they think it's because the ocean is warming.
Yeah, so maybe it used to be extra cold compared, but now. Another interesting thing was that you don't have to go like a mile offshore or less and you start seeing albatrosses. Way different than here.
Yeah, especially on the down south, you can quite often see them from shore. I've seen them from my house, but only when it's very windy and they come in closer to shore where we live.
Nice. So is that because of the continental shelf? Like I know that the islands just drop off fast to deep water. Maybe that's got something to do with it.
Where you were in Kaikoura there, it drops off. There's a huge trench that's only a few miles offshore. And that's why they have the whale watching there, because the sperm whales, which dive very deeply, are near shore. So
Yeah.
that's part of it, yeah.
You didn't mention any mammal predators for like the albatross. They do okay breeding on the islands. I mean, there's such big birds on the ground there breeding, but
Yeah, the islands that they're successful breeding on don't have pests, either naturally or the pests have been removed.
Okay.
They will get at the eggs.
yeah.
Are they raptors?
No.
No raptors?
Oh,
And-
in New Zealand?
Yeah.
Yes, there's one hawk and one falcon and one native owl.
And so do they eat the mammals that have been poisoned?
It's, I don't think it's a huge problem.
But that poison doesn't affect the birds.
Very minimal.
Why don't we have it in this country?
Because we have a lot of mammals. Like it would kill all the native mammals.
Oh,
Yeah, the only way they can get away with that is because there are no native mammals.
No snakes either.
And no snakes. Well, there are no native land mammals. There's one species of bat, but it's not very widespread.
I guess I had a question. So the census that they're doing, they're using eBird.
Mhm.
But you mentioned that the people on the project are submitting a lot of those checklists. How common is, I mean, what's the state of bird watching in New Zealand? When you go out there, are people like, what is this guy doing? Or like lots of bird watchers there.
Well, like I say, the rarest thing I see when I go out birding in New Zealand is a birder.
really?
At least in our area. I've met all of them, and most of them are biologists or retired biologists.
I noticed that eBird is not very filled with entries when I went there. Like-
Yeah,
Yeah.
it can be kind of sparse, you know. Which is why on this project, they're really urging people to seek out areas that are, you know, underreported. And there are people who are submitting tons and tons of checklists.
It's interesting because you think, I mean, culturally, they're derived from England in a way, at least the
Generally,
white population there. And then, but they just don't, I mean, because birding is very popular in Britain. But it's maybe just like the population being so like lower in New Zealand, it just, never caught on, or I mean, what?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but, I mean, there are areas where it's more popular, but it's generally a small community.
It's a different kind of birding because of the fewer individuals. I know it's like it's not a rush. You got to go out there and hunt for those birds.
Yeah, yeah. Although, even in that situation, you can get surprised in a good
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, right.
I have found some interesting things over time.
So if I was gonna go to New Zealand, would you recommend a tour person or group?
Well, there's one really.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, I could do that.
Is that the group that Steve went out to see the albatrosses with, or is that a different sort of
Oh,
subspecialty?
that's all they do. They live in Kaikoura there and they go out and see the albatrosses. And like you said, Gary was your captain, right?
Yeah,
That guy's amazing, man.
he knows everything.
Yeah. And I mean, he even knows individual birds. Oh, that albatross. Yeah, yeah, that's pretty cool.
He was a nice guy. And I should say that for birders, the other good thing about New Zealand is although there are few birds, everyone you see is something you never seen before from up here. So it's fun. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, so the Wacos that you saw there, they're flightless rails, and like you said, they'll steal your stuff. I mean, one of my stories is we were hiking and we sat down and it was lunch, and I had my lunch bag sitting in front of me, and one of those things came running out of the bushes, full speed, never slowed down, just grabbed the bag way through. And the other sort of cheeky birds are the parrots. The kias and the cacas is the other kind of the big parrot. And the cacas they live down in Stewart Island, and so like when you check into your hotel, they tell you do not leave the windows open because those parrots will come in the room and just tear everything up. And the kias will strip the weather stripping off of your car, like any sort of rubber bit, they just get in there and tear it off. And there was a story of a woman who was hiking and she put her little butt bag down and Kia stole it and flew off with it and it had her passport on.
Oh.
So, they can be troublesome. And like with the Kia, they're mountain birds, and they have a program where they have a lot of these old shacks in the mountains for mountaineers and stuff, and a lot of them were built with lead in the roof and stuff, and the parrots go up there and they tear it apart and they get lead poisoning. So they have a program where they're going out and retrofitting all of those to prevent the parrots from perishing, because I think the Kia population is 5,000 or something.
So are the people of New Zealand supportive of all of these programs? Because they're not big birds?
They are generally supportive of these programs until you tell them your cat is a predator. And then they're not as supportive because we're the pest breed program to be successful, and they got rid of all of those kinds of animals. House cats are a huge problem that they're going to have to deal with.
Is the baiting program, the poison program, would that potentially affect dogs and cats if they have like free roaming pets?
It could, because they're mammals, but they tend to lay that out in quite remote areas. They give a warning. It's not generally a problem. Which isn't to say that, dogs haven't got poisons, but it's quite rare.
You had a slide that showed like a protest, like an anti-poison protest.
Yes.
What's that situation like, and what is the argument that the anti-side is trying to push?
Well, you're laying poison out, which is not, wouldn't be my ideal approach, but in this particular situation, it works well. And all the studies that have been done, shows that it dissipates rapidly and it doesn't get into the waterways and it doesn't affect other organisms, and or the effects are quite minimal. But the thought of just dumping poison all over the place is, sometimes you got to do what you got to do.
I guess.
Okay, other questions? For Glenn? Or for Steve? We've sort of deferred our Steve question.
Well, Glenn answered them.
So there are many great stories, like I was talking about the Black Robin story, and there's just all sorts of crazy heroic conservation stories like that, about how they moved entire populations of birds to remote islands, and like the saddleback, the one you saw on Nova Island there.
Yeah.
That was the first one back in the 1960s. They captured the entire population and moved it to a different island. And now there's thousands of them.
It looked very happy, I thought.
Then what about the kiwi? That's their national bird.
Right, the kiwi. Haven't even talked about the kiwi.
It's gonna be there.
So there's 5 species of kiwi. One of them is super rare and very threatened. It only lives on offshore islands. The rest of them have various levels of success, but mostly dogs are a huge problem for kiwis, and also the rats and stoats and things. So historically, their populations are way down, but they're relatively stable. And in some areas, they're actually quite common. But they're hard to see because they come out on night.
Did you say you became a bird ever?
Well, I spent a lot more time looking at birds once I so it was interesting.
Okay, well, I guess we'll wrap it up then. Thank you again very much, Glenn. And thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
And thank everybody. We'll sort of touch base and discuss, whether this was a successful experiment. Certainly it was a success as far as I'm concerned, just to be able to get both of you together to talk about New Zealand birds. Hope to see some of you either in the room or in Zoom on Saturday down at Carpinteria Bus. And we'll see you next month. So long.
See you next month. I think it worked pretty well, the Zoom and room thing.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, bye everybody.
Bye.